Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. My name is Suzanne Loftus, and I'm pleased to have with me on the show today Ms. Eileen O'Connor, the Senior Vice President for the Rockefeller Foundation, in charge of communications, policy, and advocacy. Hi, Eileen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
The Marshall Center was also pleased to host Eileen last year. She came to speak for our program on terrorism and security studies, and that was a great success, and we thank you for that as well.
That was an honor, really, to address such a great crowd.
So now Eileen is working for the Rockefeller Foundation, which is very exciting. And if you could please share a little bit with us about that. What does the Rockefeller Foundation primarily do, and what are its priorities today, as well as your main role within the organization?
Well, J.D. Rockefeller, basically created the organization and the Rockefeller Foundation almost as he did with the creation of a corporate governance in corporate America. And he really looked at philanthropy in a different way. He had a few principles that he felt and that we still follow today, which is that we use data and science to really drive analysis of the problems that we're facing. We use innovative solutions to solve those problems. And we also partner with others, and sometimes unlikely partners. And we bring together experts who might not agree to find consensus on some solutions. But in partnering, we also partner with investors, public and private, so that we can scale the solutions and really have the greatest impact. And also, finally, we make sure that the solutions are sustainable so that philanthropy can exit, and the solution that we found will still go on even without constant philanthropic dollars. So today, what we've been doing is we have four major priorities, which is nutritious food, alleviating food scarcity, as well as providing economic opportunity for those who have been left behind, both in the United States and around the world. And we are also very much focused on ending energy poverty, which really keeps so many people from participating fully in the economy and being able to educate their children or access healthcare, as well as precision public health. And what does that mean? That means using data and innovative technology to really improve the global health system.
Well, that's really significant work, and it must be really fulfilling to be involved in all those projects. I saw on the website that you've been spearheading a national testing and tracing program as well in the United States. And since we're all in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, I think it would be extra interesting for the public to know what that project is about and what your objectives with that project are.
Well, the Rockefeller Foundation has a long history of working in public health. And J.D. Rockefeller first took experts down to the South, where hookworm was a huge impediment to economic development and to keeping kids in school and keeping people at work. And he helped eradicate hookworm by discovering that it was really sanitation and public sanitation that was the cause of this recurring disease. So that was the start of actually public health. And so given that legacy, we looked around and saw that this pandemic does not have to have the consequences that it has had. And it's largely because there hasn't been, particularly in the United States, a coordinating testing, tracing, and targeted isolation plan implemented in the United States. And also one that really promotes the public safety measures that we know work, like mask wearing and social distancing. So what we did is look at all of the expert advice, and we are also now working with the government and with states and local cities and territories, Native American territories across the country, to get them tests, to help them plan how to use those tests, and also to help them with contact tracing and targeted isolation, as well as communications campaigns around mask wearing and safety measures. So we had put out several reports, and again, just using the legacy and using those principles I described before, we brought together over the summer, well, actually between May and the end of June, over 150 experts from all sorts of areas and academia, public health, government, private sector, lab industry, test developers. And we really came up with this plan that scales both PCR, which are the more accurate, mostly accurate tests, but they require a lab, and then antigen tests, which are rapid point of care tests that have only recently been developed. And the key there is to get as many of those tests onto the market and to get them utilized almost every day so that people can go back to work safely. If you test positive, then you can be isolated and stay home from work and hopefully be supported in that by the government or local communities. And that way you get people out of the chain of transmission and you stop the disease in its track by stopping those who are contagious from entering the workforce, from entering school, and from staying out in the public. And we know that 40% of the spread has been through asymptomatic patients. So asymptomatic people who have the disease and may never get symptoms. So one of the things we've been promoting is the testing of asymptomatic people. And it's been kind of controversial, and we're not really sure why, because other countries like South Korea and Japan and others have been doing this for a while. So
Do you think it's because it's expensive that they think that it's controversial? Because it's true that it makes sense to test the asymptomatic so that you stop the spread. But I've heard everywhere that they say only test yourself if you have symptoms. So what do you think is the controversy there?
well, at first it was because there was a scarcity of tests,
Mhm.
and you do need to confirm the diagnosis, but it doesn't make sense. And there has also been, unfortunately, folks who say, well, more testing leads to more cases, but actually more testing leads to less cases if you can use that testing to take people out of the line of transmission, that chain of transmission. And we know that this works because this was what was done in Ebola. And the United States immediately went in, partnered with others, but really took charge and took leadership in the Ebola crisis by bringing in data experts, by basically putting a focus on getting testing result times down from 4 days to 4 hours so that they could quickly figure out what were the things that were spreading the disease. And in that case, they found out that the burial customs were very much a cause of a lot of the spread of the disease. So by working with community leaders, religious leaders, cultural leaders, they were able to alter those customs, educate people, and be able to stop the spread of the disease.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, the United States took a leadership role when it came to the Ebola virus and was actively involved with the international community. Do you find that the United States is taking a bit less of that type of role and is less involved? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because the United States has 4% of the world's population, and yet 20 to 25% of the cases at any given time. So, with that kind of a record, it's not unusual that countries would not look to the United States for leadership. And unfortunately, as you know, politically, we have been retreating from the world stage, and we haven't been taking our usual position, working with our allies in Europe and across the world, to actually take a leadership position. And I think it's been a problem because we're not exactly a great example. We're actually one of the countries that has done the poorest in controlling this disease. So it's not a surprise that people are not looking to the United States for leadership right now.
Well, thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation for all the efforts that they're making with this pandemic. I mean, it's certainly very helpful in everything that you've just explained. So, the Rockefeller Foundation is currently focused on resetting the future, especially in terms of economic opportunity and climate change. What type of future do you think we're looking at here? And do you collaborate also with the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, since they're highly involved in the same types of activities with their fourth industrial revolution and resetting the future of jobs and of work? Would you mind telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we believe that we cannot go back to the status quo because the inequities that have been shown by COVID are just so stark. And they're really caused by, the inability of people to provide decent education, a roof over their head, food, etc., and even, and weather a storm like COVID. And also, they're working hard. We know so many Americans, 40% of American workers are still have about only $400 in savings to weather a storm like COVID, despite the fact that they're full-time workers. Many of them, as you know, don't have access to insurance. And this is not just in the United States, it's around the world. When you have 2% of the American population owning 50% of the wealth, something's wrong. And so we also know that those people, hourly workers and others who we hailed as heroes, as frontline workers, because they kept the trains running. They are nurses' aides in nursing homes. They're people who stock our grocery store shelves. But they were the people that were getting sick the most and were dying at a much higher rate because they don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to nutritious food. And we also know that, for the last 25 years, we've been pulling people out of poverty. But the World Bank has estimated that we're going to be pushing back because of lack of energy access, as well as lack of economic growth due to COVID. We'll be pushing back about over 100 million people back into extreme poverty. So something is obviously wrong with the system if this kind of thing can just push 25 years of progress just backwards overnight. So we believe we have to reimagine the future, and we have to have a future that is more equitable and provides more equitable opportunity for all. And that also means participation in the economy, because one of the problems that we've seen is that, especially globally, there's 800 million people who do not have access to productive energy. And this is the kind of energy that will enable you to build a machine plant or to power a health clinic or a shop at night, or educate your children so that they can study at night with lamplight as opposed to kerosene lamp, which pollutes the environment. So what we're trying to do is, as a climate catastrophe looms, is enable those 800 million people to have distributed renewable electricity so that they can participate fully in the economy. And that would actually, that kind of an investment, we believe, would benefit all of us, because when only a few people own most of the wealth, they're not spending it in a way that's going to grow the economy. They're not buying food. They're not buying consumer goods. They're not buying houses. They're not renting more than a couple of apartments. And so the problem is we need to fix this system so that there is more economic equity across the globe.
And that could solve two problems at once. We're saying that we're losing the manufacturing sector in the United States, that the economy is now more resembling an hourglass figure where the center is hollowed out. If we just invest in renewable energy projects, we could create more jobs in this sector, and this would, as you say, improve economic disparity issues and solve problems with climate change. I think we're too quick to judge that these renewable sources of energy are perhaps not efficient enough to make cheap products.
Well, they become incredibly more efficient and more cost effective. And over the last few years, the technology has advanced significantly. So now is the time to invest in green infrastructure. And look, we don't have a choice, because the effects of climate change are going to be catastrophic. This is not just, it's not about just extreme weather. It's about the fact that people, countries will flood. There will be huge migratory patterns. We will have more disease like we've had with this pandemic, because there will be a lot more effects on the environment, and there will be a transfer of more zoological diseases due to extreme weather patterns. So it isn't an option anymore to deal with climate change. It's a necessity. And again, it's also spending this money and working on this is not something that is just a good thing to do. It's a really good investment. And that's what we're hoping to be able to tell the world, and particularly the private sector and global financial institutions, that we can join together. And Rockefeller is willing to put concessionary capital into this. So we'll be the first ones to, quote unquote, lose money. But really, we think it's an investment worth making, and we don't see it as a loss. We see it as overall a gain.
In terms of United States leadership, as we discussed a little bit before, the US, not only has it been accused of not taking much of a leadership role in this pandemic, but also with climate change and what we were just talking about now in terms of renewable energies. And since the Rockefeller Foundation is active in these climate change initiatives, what type of changes have you noticed when working with these initiatives in developing countries in that respect? The fact that the US is no longer seen as having taken the lead in that specific sector. Do you find that your diplomatic relations with developing countries have changed, or that the US is not as active in some of these regions? It'd be great to have your take on that.
Well, if the United States is not participating in things like the Paris Accord, or also even at the same time deregulating or uh, industry, particularly dirty fuel industries. I mean, there's been a huge rollback of environmental protections that had been instituted in the United States in terms of clean electricity and water, et cetera. Um, when when other countries see us doing that, they feel like, well, why should I reduce my emissions? Because, just like we are 4% of the world's population and 25% of COVID cases, we also are about 25% of the we are to blame for about 25% of emissions. So it's impossible to lead if we are not doing the right thing in terms of climate. And so it's also impossible to influence people to do the right thing if we're not doing the right thing. So I think that has been a huge issue. But what's interesting, though, is that businesses in the United States and states in the United States are taking a very aggressive climate approach as much as they can, certainly with their own state lands, while federal regulations apply to federal lands within states. States are sort of pushing back on those things, and there are a number of lawsuits against some of the deregulation that I think at least signals that the private sector, the people of the United States, polls show that, are very interested in climate change and do want the United States to take action and to also to lead on this effort and to bring others along in combating what is really an existential crisis to the globe.
Mhm. Well, that's excellent news that states are taking individual action, because it's really something very critical that we must address as soon as possible. And how about in terms of infrastructure development? Is the Rockefeller involved in these types of projects globally? Because as we're talking about great power competition in the security sector these days, the Belt and Road Initiative is an it's basically an initiative by the Chinese to be involved in these infrastructure development projects all around the world, and they now have a lot of influence in these countries as well. So when the Rockefeller Foundation gets involved in developing countries, do you notice that there's extra Chinese influence relative to US influence in these countries in terms of these projects?
Well, we've been focused in India, and we've also done some work in Myanmar, and now we're looking to invest in Africa. And so far in India, we haven't seen the Chinese influence as much in these situations. We are partnered with Tata Power there, so we're partnered with a private sector Indian company there in trying to provide at least 10,000 solar panel microgrids in the next few years, and eventually raising that up to 100,000 of those microgrids. And so ultimately, we can provide power, productive power, the amount of power that you would need to run a business to 250 million people as this project goes forward. But as you know, I was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Obama administration, and the Belt and Road Initiative very much mirrors something that the Obama administration did, which was called the Silk Road Initiative, which is something that at the time, then Secretary Clinton really put forward. And that was to invest in infrastructure projects and certainly trade and economic projects throughout South and Central Asia. And unfortunately, though, the United States didn't fund these projects in the same way. And so China is, in fact, has been promoting, this Belt and Road Initiative which does lend money to countries. But I do think that there is some issues with it in terms of the Chinese control, how many jobs it really creates for these countries, because often Chinese workers will come in to build the big infrastructure projects. So while I do think that there has been some influence, and certainly under the with COVID, the Chinese have done a very good job of helping supply PPE, tests, and other measures to countries in the Belt and Road Initiative in order to enable them to deal with the COVID crisis. And that, I think, is actually done far more in bringing people into China's fold than any of the prior Belt and Road investment initiatives. And unfortunately, some of these initiatives are not exactly in the interest of these countries. Some of them are not climate friendly. And some of the economic initiatives are not climate friendly. And a couple of them in particular, one major initiative is around the digital space. And that is where the Chinese government would really like more control over the internet, what people do on the internet, what people see on the internet. And so I do believe that initiative could, in fact, backfire on some countries. And some are seeing that and are sort of, I would say, reluctant to fully engage in that initiative.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. What about during the Obama administration, as you mentioned, the Silk Road project? It's a shame that it didn't go through, because that would have definitely been quite the strong counter to this BRI project. What do you think of the reasons why the Silk Road project didn't go through, as well as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have also kind of, how would you call it, tapered off some Chinese influence in the area, at least?
Well, I we've had party politics in the United States, and the parties that were controlling the Senate and others were retrenching and saying we need to spend this money in the United States, and not seeing the benefits of investing around the world. I mean, we think these kinds of investments are not just good, morally good, the right thing to do. They are really good investments, because as we started this, we have to have a different future. We cannot have the inequities that we've seen in terms of income and which is growing income disparities in the developed world, in Europe, in the United States, and parts of Asia. You can't successfully grow an economy with that kind of wealth inequity when only 2% of the United States, of the richest people in the United States, 2% of the population own 50% of the wealth in the United States. That they're not spending that money in the same way that people in the lower half would spend it on food, on items, on consumer items, on housing and education and other things. And so the economy can't grow without having a stronger and more robust and larger middle class. So we believe that a shift has to happen in terms of the economy and economic opportunity, making it more equitable. So that's something that is a big part of our focus on in the future in terms of policy initiatives that can do that. So why was aid not as focused on, and this kind of aid not as big a priority in the latter years of the Obama administration? I think it's because the politics of the United States was starting to shift. And as you saw it, the Republican platform in 2016 was about America first. And so that kind of a retrenchment has meant that there's been less investment in aid. And that's been a shame, because it hurts the United States more than it hurts anyone else.
And what about this Blue Dot Network? Have you heard of that?
It's a company in Canada that actually uses data analytics, and was able to see that factories were closing, that other entities were either people were going into hospital. There was the building of hospitals in Wuhan, other data points that they were getting. So they could see that something was up in Wuhan, and then tracking that and tracing it and following it alerted other authorities. And so that's something that the Rockefeller Foundation is also focused on in part of our Reimagining the Future. Is we believe that if we can build a pandemic action network that would use data analytics to predict and prevent the next outbreak from becoming a pandemic, because we are going to have more of these. With global transportation and with climate change, there's a lot of zoological disease that will jump from animals to people. And the fact that we have this global travel means that an outbreak of disease can quickly become a pandemic. So we're trying to develop a network and a plan, a 100-day plan that will hopefully be able to, and a data platform that would be able to predict and prevent other disease outbreaks from becoming a global pandemic, as well as utilizing data analytics to really look at chronic disease and the causes of mortality, say, for instance, for many women in childbirth. It just shouldn't be that way in the 21st century. So by using big data, and artificial intelligence, we can look at problems in a brand new way, which is very much, as I said before, part of the Rockefeller legacy.
And that's going to be very important, especially as we have condensed population in urban centers. A disease is going to spread more rapidly. We need to find a way for the next time this happens and to not have to shut down the economies and go through an economic crisis. There has to be a more developed way to deal with it. And nations need to cooperate with one another in this process.
Well, exactly. And I think the other thing is that one thing that's happened in this pandemic is that we have been able to, the technology has actually moved forward. The fact that the development of vaccines is happening at warp speed. That is one thing that the Trump administration has done right, which is really investing in and using concessionary capital to really try to drive forward the development production of a vaccine. And I think the other thing is that this we can also in the advancement that has also happened in testing, it's laid the groundwork for some new technologies for testing of diseases. And so I'm hopeful that in the future we can get tests up more rapidly, develop tests for a particular disease more rapidly, and even a vaccine for a particular disease more rapidly, as well as therapeutics.
Yeah, that's going to be needed for sure. And in terms of your Resetting the Futures project, we talked a little bit about how the U.S. relationship with the European Union is not as strong as it was. In this project, are you working with European nations, and what are the avenues that continue to demonstrate U.S.-European collaboration in this era of strained relations between the two sides of the Atlantic?
Yes, well, we're certainly working with certain European development organizations, and we are also looking at European banks and other private investors and public investors that could invest in this project, as well as working with the World Economic Forum and a variety of committees there. But also internationally, there is a commission on this kind of distributed renewable energy, and also we're really looking forward to the COP, which will be in the UK next year, and that is a climate change global convening that we are hopeful will join with us in some of these projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's fantastic, because it's good to know that there's still some areas of collaboration, and that it's not just diplomatic tensions, and that actually the U.S. and the EU are strong partners and will continue to be in important areas such as those.
I mean, I wouldn't say that it is difficult when the politics are strained, but I think that for the most part, private enterprise and philanthropy have not had the same tension with Europeans and European institutions. So we're hopeful that we can continue to work together.
And you're a communications expert too. You have quite a very impressive background. And one of the themes of this video podcast series is disinformation campaigns. So what's your take on Chinese and Russian disinformation tactics, especially some that you've seen maybe during the pandemic? And what would you say the West is doing wrong, and how can we surmount these campaigns in the future?
Well, I think what the West is doing wrong is buying into some of the conspiracy theories and not working with our own populations to discredit these conspiracies. as well as to talk in one voice about the liberties that we so dearly cherish, and talk in one voice about fact and science, and trust facts and science and expertise and objective facts, so that we are not having politicians basically utilizing and pushing conspiracy theories in order to stay in power. I mean, I'm a former war zone correspondent, and I had witnessed so many times throughout my career where politicians utilized old historic grudges, either religious, cultural grudges, and or economic grudges, in order to gain or retain power, and really exploited people's thinking around the facts. And I see Putin, we call it whataboutism. A lot of this is sort of, well, what about this? Or what about that? It could be this or it could be that. And when you do that, then there are no facts. And I've actually sat as a former reporter and someone who lived in Russia for many years. I've actually sat across the table from Putin at tea, where he actually said that to me when I said to him, "Why are you trying to control independent media?" He said, "There is no independent media. There are no facts." And I think that's somewhat what he believes, but I think more importantly, he and China and the Russian government and the Chinese government want to utilize and to push divisions within our society in order to basically disrupt and defeat democracy and democratic institutions. And unfortunately, our own politicians are buying into this plan, maybe unwittingly, but we need to have some unity on what's important. And we also need to have unity on working together within our own countries, that we're all part of the same team. And we have to sort of stop the divisiveness within our own country that China and Russia are basically exploiting in order to undermine our systems and also our institutions.
You explained that so well. I mean, the misinformation that's going on these days and the info wars, it's not the same as it was during the Cold War, where back then it's my truth versus your truth. Which one is right? Today, it's what is the truth? There is no truth, which just confuses everyone into not believing anything at all. And that's even more dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you cannot, as a society or a democracy, agree on the objective facts, then you cannot have a normative argument around policy. It's impossible. Mm-hmm. And that is why I think in Congress, in our own Congress, we have had a big problem with that. And unfortunately, our own media has become monetized, and to the point where it has basically outrage is a moneymaker. And so we have television, cable networks that are opinion at night, but unfortunately people, and they traffic in outrage. And unfortunately people don't understand the difference between news and opinion. And this is something that is really bad. And same thing on social media. We know that outrage leads to people clicking on content. And that means the more clicks is the more ads you will see, the more ads you will see, the more revenue social media giants will get. So I do think that we have to figure out, is it worth it? Is it worth it to our society that people can become billionaires at the expense of our democratic institutions, or millionaires, or make a lot of money just by being angry and telling people falsehoods? I think that is not what the United States should stand for. And it's not what it's not the best of Americans. So if it was all for one, and if it was just everybody, it's only for me. In World War II, I keep saying, my father and my uncle both were in World War II. And I think, well, what if they decided, well, I'm not doing that because I'm free and I can do whatever I want. We would not have defeated fascism. We need to join together and around our values.
You're right. And you mentioned social media and how complicated that can be. But what about traditional sources of media? Do you think that there's something that we could do in terms of the way that we portray the news? Are we doing something wrong by announcing a headline the way that we do? I mean, because people who watch CNN will think that it's unbiased news. People who watch Fox will think that that's unbiased news, but then the opponents or those who watch the other and think it's absurd. I mean, how can we get around the way that we show information so that people won't be so leaning to one side or the other, or skeptical of one side or the other?
Well, I think the onus is on both the media and on ourselves. And I also think that we need to start teaching civil liberty, civics in school more. I think we need to teach media literacy. And I also think that we need to teach critical thinking. We've sort of gotten away from teaching the scientific method and critical thinking in a lot as parts of our educational process. And I'm not really sure how that happened. But when people understand critical thinking, they can assess the facts and they can assess a variety of media outlets. But I do think that it's super dangerous for us to be wedded to one or two outlooks. And so I think that the challenge is how to get people to look at more than one thing and more than one kind of opinion flow in my newsfeed on social media, or that I'm always tuned into one, either MSNBC or Fox or CNN or BBC or Sky, or RT. If you're only watching those channels, or you're only looking at your own newsfeed and you're getting your news from your social media, from your friends, you're listening to the same thing over and over, and you're not being confronted with other facts or with counterfacts. And that's what we need, is to understand the landscape of information.
That's absolutely right. Eileen, thank you so much for this informative interview. It was really my pleasure to talk with you today.
No, it was great. And thank you so much. And I'm really great to talk to you. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
And for the audience, as usual, thanks again for tuning back into Security in the 21st Century. Stay tuned for the next episode.